In aerospace engineering, we have a phrase called a critical system fault. It's the kind of alert you never want to see blinking on a radar screen. When that message appears, it means something deep inside the system isn't behaving the way it should. Something small has gone wrong, and if nobody notices it in time, the entire machine can fail. But that feeling, seeing a critical fault warning, still doesn't compare to the moment I looked up and saw 4 silver stars on the shoulders of the man sitting in the command room. 2 weeks earlier, he had been an old veteran shaking in a snowstorm, unable to pay for a cup of coffee. Now he sat there like a mountain carved out of granite, calm and immovable, while Major Barrett, the officer who had spent the last 6 months treating me like an expendable number in a spreadsheet, stood off to the side looking pale enough to collapse. When the general lifted his eyes and looked directly at me, it felt like every thought in my head had just been scanned and filed away. "Sergeant Vance," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an order. To understand how a $5 cup of coffee turned into the most brutal internal audit our base had ever seen, you have to go back to a freezing Tuesday night at a roadside rest stop outside the city. That night, I had just finished a 14-hour maintenance shift. Satellite calibration is not glamorous work. It means sitting inside metal rooms full of humming equipment, staring at lines of code and signal logs until your eyes blur. By the time I clocked out, my uniform smelled like machine oil and burnt circuitry. The snow had started falling sometime after midnight. Not a gentle snowfall, but the kind of wind-driven storm that rattles the windows and pushes sheets of ice across the highway. I pulled into the rest stop mostly because I needed caffeine strong enough to keep me awake for the drive back to base. The gas station cafe was half empty. A few truck drivers sat in the corner watching muted television screens while the cashier leaned on the counter looking bored and tired. I stepped inside, stamping snow off my boots, and walked toward the coffee machine. That's when I noticed the old man. He stood near the register wearing a faded military jacket that had clearly seen better decades. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to slide a plastic card into the payment machine. The screen flashed, declined. He tried again. Declined. The cashier sighed. "Sir, the card isn't going through." The man looked embarrassed. "I must have entered the wrong number," he said quietly. He tried again. Declined. People in line behind him began shifting impatiently. One of the truck drivers muttered something under his breath. The cashier tapped the counter with a fingernail. "Sir, if you don't have another way to pay..." The old man looked down at the counter, where a small coffee and a paper bag with 2 dry sandwiches waited. For a second, he didn't move. Then he slowly reached for the bag, clearly preparing to leave it behind. I stepped forward before I really thought about it. "It's okay," I said. The cashier looked at me. I pulled out my card and tapped the payment reader. The screen beeped. Approved. I slid the coffee and the bag toward the old man. "Consider it a thank you," I said, "for serving." The old veteran looked at me carefully. His eyes were sharp, far sharper than the rest of him suggested. He glanced at the name tape on my uniform. "Sergeant Vance," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." He held the coffee cup in both hands, like it was the warmest thing in the world. Then he asked a strange question. "Sergeant, if a system appears to be functioning perfectly, but one impossible number suddenly shows up in the data, what do you do?" It was such a technical question that I almost laughed. "Report it," I said, "even if it ruins someone's perfect report." The old man studied me for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Good answer." At the time, I thought nothing of it. I just assumed he was another retired soldier who used to work around equipment like the rest of us. 2 weeks later, standing in the command center while Major Barrett trembled beside the wall, I finally understood why he had asked that question. Because that cup of coffee had never been about kindness. It had been a test. Major Barrett arrived at the base the following Monday. The first thing people noticed about him wasn't his rank or his voice. It was the spreadsheets. Barrett carried them everywhere. Printed reports, performance charts, operational statistics, pages full of numbers that he treated with the kind of respect most officers reserve for battlefield maps. To him, a base wasn't made of people. It was made of metrics. Within his first week, he gathered the entire maintenance unit inside the operations room and introduced what he proudly called Operation Zero Error. According to Barrett, our base had been performing adequately for years, but adequate wasn't acceptable anymore. "We are not here to perform adequately," he said, pacing slowly in front of the screen behind him. "We are here to produce perfect operational reports." The word perfect stayed in the room long after the briefing ended. At first, it didn't sound unreasonable. Satellite systems demand precision, and nobody objects to higher standards when they're presented as a mission objective. But Barrett's version of perfection had nothing to do with engineering. It had everything to do with appearances. Within a month, the pressure inside the unit became impossible to ignore. Barrett demanded daily performance summaries, weekly efficiency reports, and constant updates on error margins across every satellite system we maintained. Minor discrepancies that would normally trigger routine troubleshooting suddenly became disciplinary issues. One afternoon, a young technician named Alvarez reported a 2-millisecond timing delay in one of the orbital relay systems. The delay wasn't dangerous, but it was unusual enough that it deserved investigation. Barrett looked at the report and frowned. 2 milliseconds, he said. "And you're reporting this as a system irregularity?" "Yes, sir." Barrett closed the file, then corrected it. "Sir, the delay appears to be external signal interference. We should run diagnostics." Barrett leaned back in his chair. "Or," he said slowly, "you could recalibrate the report and remove the discrepancy." The room went quiet. Alvarez hesitated. "Sir, that wouldn't be accurate." Barrett's expression hardened. "Accuracy," he said calmly, "is determined by command authority." That moment changed the atmosphere inside the unit. Technicians stopped reporting small irregularities. Engineers began double-checking reports, not to confirm problems, but to ensure that nothing appeared out of place. Every system summary had to show smooth lines, stable signals, and operational percentages that looked flawless during weekly command briefings. Barrett called it discipline. Most of us called it theater. The pressure grew worse with each passing week. Maintenance shifts stretched longer because Barrett demanded that every report pass through his desk before submission. Any number that disrupted the smooth performance graphs was flagged immediately. "Your job," he reminded us during one late-night meeting, "is not to create problems. Your job is to ensure the system works." The message was clear. If something looked wrong, it was better not to see it. By the middle of the month, the unit was exhausted. People were working 16-hour rotations just to keep the reporting structure intact. Barrett walked through the control room like an auditor inspecting faulty equipment, stopping occasionally to correct a phrase or highlight a statistic that didn't meet his standards. One night, he stopped beside my station. "What are you reviewing, Sergeant Vance?" "Satellite relay logs, sir." He leaned over the console and studied the data scrolling across the screen. "Everything functioning?" "Yes, sir." "Good," Barrett said. "Let's keep it that way." He walked away without another word. But something about the way he said it bothered me. Barrett wasn't interested in whether the systems were actually healthy. What he cared about was whether the reports looked healthy. The difference between those two things might seem small to someone outside engineering. Inside a command network, it can be the difference between control and collapse. That night, I stayed later than usual reviewing the system logs. The servers hummed quietly around me while the snowstorm outside the base walls continued to build. Satellite telemetry streamed across the screen in endless lines of numbers and timestamps. Everything looked normal, at least at first. Then I noticed something strange buried inside the log sequence. It wasn't a system failure. It wasn't even a visible error. It was just a number, a tiny fragment of code repeating inside the signal stream where it shouldn't exist. The kind of number most people would ignore. But the old veteran's question from the cafe suddenly returned to my mind. If a system appears to be functioning perfectly, but one impossible number shows up in the data, what do you do? I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I opened a new report window. Because whatever Barrett wanted his reports to look like, there was one thing I had learned long before joining the Air Force. Systems don't lie. People do. The number appeared at 2:17 in the morning. At first, it looked like nothing more than a minor irregularity buried inside the satellite relay logs. Thousands of lines of telemetry pass through the system every hour. Signal strength, orbital coordinates, relay timing, encryption handshakes. Engineers learn quickly that most anomalies are harmless noise created by environmental interference or temporary data distortion. But this one was different. The code sequence repeated every 17 minutes with almost perfect consistency. It didn't interrupt the system. It didn't change the signal path. In fact, the network continued operating exactly as expected. That was what made it strange. Perfect systems rarely produce meaningless numbers. I zoomed into the log window and ran a deeper diagnostic. The sequence wasn't random. It was structured, embedded carefully between two timing packets where most technicians would never bother looking, a marker, or maybe a signal. I opened a report and forwarded the anomaly to Major Barrett's office with a short explanation. Possible irregular code fragment inside relay data stream requires investigation. His response arrived 20 minutes later. Report to my office immediately. Barrett's office lights were still on when I knocked. He sat behind his desk, staring at the printed logs I had sent earlier, his expression already tight with irritation. "You filed this report?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Barrett tapped the page with his pen. "You're suggesting that one of our satellite systems contains unauthorized code." "I'm suggesting the sequence shouldn't be there." He leaned back in his chair. "Is the system malfunctioning?" "No, sir." "Is the signal compromised?" "No." "Then explain to me why you're wasting my time." I stepped forward and placed a printed section of the logbook on his desk. The sequence repeats every 17 minutes. It doesn't affect operations, but it's not part of the authorized signal structure. Barrett glanced at the paper for less than 2 seconds. Then he pushed it aside. "This base currently reports 100% operational stability," he said calmly. "Every system is functioning within acceptable parameters." "Yes, sir." "So why?" he continued. "Would you submit a report suggesting a hidden fault?" "Because the number is there?" Barrett stared at me for a long moment. Then his voice hardened. "Sergeant Vance, your responsibility is to maintain system stability, not to invent theoretical problems." "It's not theoretical." Barrett stood slowly. "Let me explain something to you," he said. "Command reports travel upward through several levels of leadership before reaching strategic command. Those reports must reflect reliability." He tapped the logbook again. "This does not reflect reliability. So we investigate it." "No," Barrett replied. "You correct it." For a moment I didn't understand what he meant. "Sir?" "Adjust the log sequence," he said flatly. "Remove the anomaly and resubmit the report." The room felt colder. "That would falsify the data." Barrett's expression changed. "Careful, Sergeant." I met his eyes. "The number exists in the system." He walked around the desk slowly until he stood directly in front of me. "You're new to command-level operations," he said quietly. "Let me help you understand something about military reporting." He pointed toward the logbook. "Data supports command decisions. It does not challenge them." I didn't move. "With respect, sir, the system either contains the number or it doesn't." Barrett sighed. Then he returned to his desk and opened a file folder. "Very well," he said calmly. "If you're determined to create problems, we'll document them." He began writing. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Recording a disciplinary action." The pen scratched across the paper. "Failure to follow corrective instruction," he continued. "Operational negligence regarding sensitive satellite logs." That's not accurate. Barrett didn't look up. You were ordered to correct the report. You ordered me to falsify it. His pen stopped. Then he signed the document. Sergeant Vance, he said quietly, you are hereby removed from active systems access pending review. The words landed harder than I expected. That means, Barrett continued, your clearance to the relay servers is suspended effective immediately. He slid the paper across the desk. Until the investigation concludes, you will perform auxiliary duties. Auxiliary duties? Facility maintenance, he said. The message was obvious. I was being pushed out. Within an hour, my access credentials stopped working. The system terminals refused my login attempts, while other technicians avoided eye contact as I passed through the control room. By the end of the shift, I was standing outside the maintenance warehouse, wearing thick gloves and a reflective vest, while snow drifted across the runway lights. The storm had returned. My assignment was simple: clear ice from the storage yard. It was the kind of work normally assigned to temporary contractors, not satellite engineers. But Barrett had made his point clear. Anyone who challenged his perfect reports would disappear. The wind pushed snow across the concrete while I worked with a steel shovel under the yellow security lights. My hands were numb, and the cold cut through the heavy uniform layers like glass. For a moment, I wondered if Barrett might actually succeed in pushing me out of the Air Force. Then I remembered the old man at the cafe, his sharp eyes, his strange question, and the way he had studied my answer. If an impossible number appears in the system, what do? You report the truth, even when the truth destroys someone's perfect report. Standing in the freezing yard that night, I realized something important. Barrett believed he had punished the problem. What he had actually done was expose himself to it, because the number I had reported wasn't just a coding anomaly, it was a test. And Barrett had just failed it. The summons arrived the following morning. I had just finished another hour clearing ice from the equipment yard when a security vehicle pulled up beside the maintenance building. A young lieutenant stepped out and walked toward me holding a tablet. Sergeant Vance? Yes, sir. You're requested at the command headquarters immediately. The words sounded formal, but the tone suggested something else. Urgency. I wiped the snow from my gloves and climbed into the vehicle without asking questions. During the short drive across the base, the lieutenant didn't speak. The silence made the entire ride feel heavier than it should have. Command headquarters sat near the center of the base, a concrete structure with narrow windows and thick steel doors designed more for security than comfort. By the time I stepped inside, I could already see Major Barrett standing near the conference room doors. He looked confident. Too confident. A thick folder rested under his arm, the same type used for official disciplinary hearings. When he noticed me approaching, a thin smile crossed his face. Right on time, Sergeant, Barrett said. What's this about? You'll see soon enough. He pushed open the conference room door and gestured for me to enter first. The room was larger than I expected, with a long table stretching across the center and several high-ranking officers seated along the sides. Their uniforms carried a mix of insignias and command badges I rarely saw outside official briefings. Barrett walked in behind me and placed his folder on the table. Gentlemen, he said confidently, this hearing concerns operational negligence by Sergeant Maya Vance regarding sensitive satellite telemetry. He opened the folder and began distributing copies of the disciplinary report. As you can see, he continued, Sergeant Vance submitted a false system anomaly report, refused corrective instructions, and disrupted our base's operational reporting structure. The officers studied the papers quietly. Barrett straightened his posture. I believe removal from the technical unit is appropriate pending further review. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a chair at the far end of the room slowly turned around. The man sitting there hadn't been visible when I entered. His uniform was immaculate. 4 silver stars rested on each shoulder. The same old veteran from the Snowstorm Cafe. Major Barrett froze. For the first time since I had known him, his confidence vanished completely. General Thorne, Barrett stammered. "I wasn't aware you were visiting the base." General Silas Thorne didn't respond immediately. He simply looked down at the disciplinary report Barrett had handed out, turning a page slowly as if he had all the time in the world. Then he spoke. "Major Barrett," he said calmly, "do you know what the anomaly Sergeant Vance reported actually was?" Barrett cleared his throat. "A coding irregularity in the relay logs, sir." General Thorne leaned back slightly. "No," he said. "It wasn't." The room grew quiet. The general tapped the page with one finger. "That sequence is known as a canary code." Barrett frowned. "I'm not familiar with that term, sir." "I'm not surprised." The general folded the report and placed it on the table. A canary code is a diagnostic marker embedded inside a system to test operational honesty. It appears harmless, produces a tiny numerical inconsistency, and does not affect the system's performance. He paused. But it does something very useful. Every officer in the room was listening now. It reveals who is actually doing their job. Barrett's face slowly lost color. The general continued. 3 weeks ago, I authorized the insertion of that code across 5 different satellite bases. The goal was simple. We wanted to know which technicians would notice the anomaly and which commanders would attempt to hide it. He looked directly at me. Sergeant Vance was the only technician across all 5 installations who reported it accurately. The room remained silent. Then the general turned his attention back to Barrett. "You, Major, responded differently." Barrett swallowed. "Sir, I believe the report could damage operational confidence." "You ordered her to falsify the logs." Barrett didn't answer. The general's voice remained calm. "You attempted to bury the anomaly in order to protect your performance metrics." Barrett looked around the room desperately. "Sir, I was maintaining command efficiency." "No," the general interrupted. "You were protecting a report." The words hit the room like a hammer. General Thorne leaned forward slightly. "The purpose of Operation Canary was to identify officers who prioritize appearance over integrity. Satellite systems protect national security. If commanders begin altering data to preserve perfect reports, the entire structure becomes unreliable." Barrett's voice cracked. "Sir, I was only following procedure." The general raised a hand. "That will be enough." He turned to the officers seated along the table. Major Barrett knowingly attempted to suppress a legitimate system report and retaliated against the technician who filed it. One of the colonels nodded slowly. General Thorne stood. "Effective immediately," he said. "Major Barrett is relieved of command pending formal investigation." Barrett looked stunned. "Sir, you can't be serious." The general's expression didn't change. "I am extremely serious." Security officers stepped forward quietly from the hallway. Barrett's shoulders sagged as the reality finally reached him. His perfect reports had just destroyed his career. General Thorne then turned toward me. "Sergeant Vance." "Yes, sir." "You did exactly what the system required." He paused briefly. "And exactly what the Air Force requires." For a moment, the tension in the room finally eased. Then the general added one final sentence. "And Sergeant—" "Yes, sir?" The coffee was excellent. The investigation ended faster than most people expected. Within 48 hours, Major Barrett's access to command systems was revoked, and an internal review team from headquarters arrived at the base to examine every report he had signed during the previous 6 months. Once auditors began comparing the raw satellite logs with the official summaries Barrett had submitted, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Numbers had been adjusted, irregularities had been removed, several minor anomalies had simply disappeared from the reports entirely. None of the changes were large enough to break the system, but that wasn't the point. Satellite command depends on one principle above all others: trust in the data. When officers begin shaping numbers to protect their reputation, that trust disappears. Barrett's career ended quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no speech, no public explanation. His name simply vanished from the command roster the following week, replaced by a temporary operations officer sent from headquarters. Inside the unit, people understood exactly what had happened. For the first time in months, the maintenance room felt normal again. Engineers reported irregular signals without hesitation. Technicians spoke openly during system checks instead of worrying whether a number might make someone look bad. And as strange as it sounded, all of that started because of a single number that refused to behave the way a perfect report expected it to. 2 days after the investigation ended, I was called back to command headquarters. This time, the atmosphere inside the building felt completely different. Officers moved calmly through the halls, and the tension that had once hung in the air seemed to have disappeared. General Silas Thorne was waiting in the same conference room where the hearing had taken place. When I entered, he gestured toward a chair. "At ease, Sergeant." I sat down. For a moment he studied the folder in front of him before sliding a document across the table. "Your disciplinary record has been cleared," he said. "Every charge filed by Major Barrett has been removed?" I nodded. "Thank you, sir." "That's not the reason you're here." He opened the folder and removed another sheet of paper. "This," he said, "is a commendation for exceptional integrity under command pressure." The words sounded strange coming from someone with 4 stars on his shoulders. "I was just doing my job," I replied. The general smiled slightly. "That's exactly why the commendation exists." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Do you remember the coffee shop?" "Yes, sir." "The storm was impressive," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure anyone would stop long enough to notice an old man standing at the counter." "I noticed because the card machine kept rejecting your payment." The general nodded once. "That was intentional." I blinked. "You tested me?" "Not exactly," he said. "I observed you." He looked down at the commendation for a moment before continuing. "Integrity doesn't appear during ceremonies or inspections. It appears during ordinary moments when no one thinks their choices matter." The room fell silent. After a moment, he slid the document toward me. "Keep doing your job the way you did that night," he said. "The Air Force doesn't need perfect reports. It needs people who refuse to lie about imperfect systems." I stood and saluted. "Yes, sir." The general returned the salute calmly. A week later, after the base returned fully to normal operations, I found myself driving past the same roadside rest stop where everything had started. The snow was gone now, replaced by clear winter sunlight and quiet traffic along the highway. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot. The cafe looked exactly the same as before. The same coffee machine hummed behind the counter, and a few young airmen sat near the windows, laughing over their phones. When I ordered my coffee, the cashier handed me the cup and shook his head. "No charge," he said. "Why not?" He pointed toward a small sign taped beside the register. "Veterans and active duty personnel. Coffee paid for by the Thorne Foundation." I looked at the sign for several seconds before stepping aside. Outside the window, the young airman continued laughing, completely unaware of the quiet test that had unfolded weeks earlier. That was when I finally understood something important. A soldier's strength isn't measured by what they do when everyone is watching. It's measured by the choices they make when they stand alone in the cold, when the numbers look wrong, and when telling the truth might cost them everything. Sometimes the most powerful act in the military isn't winning a battle. Sometimes it's simply refusing to hide the truth.